Hello, everybody. In this video, I am planning to dive deep into price ceiling and price floor, namely price control. And we're gonna follow this subsequent sequence. The first one is to discuss what what are the and when they are binding, when they're truly effective. And then we're going to talk about examples of those price controls as well as the consequence in real life. And the last part is that we are going to talk about the social welfare perspective, namely how such a price control changes the division of social surplus, namely consumer surplus, producer surplus, and causes distortion of the market, which result into deadweight loss. So let's start with the preparation part. So when we introduced market equilibrium, as we were talking about the dynamic feature of equilibrium, we mentioned two possible deviations, which are temporary. So we draw the setup here. We have a downward demand, upward sloping supply for both cases. So first we know if there is no intervention and we assume away any market failure, eventually the market is gonna stabilize at this equilibrium point on the third graph, which is the intersection between supply and demand. But if we have too low price or too high a price, price too low, price too high, what's gonna happen? Well, there's gonna be a mismatch of the market, right? In which case the market does not clear anymore. And here that mismatch is reflected by unequal quantities. So how do we find those quantities first? So here there is a pretty intuitive way to do that. So this quantity that my pen is pointing at comes from supply, therefore it is quantity supplied. And the next quantity comes from demand, therefore it's quantity demanded. And in the first case, quantity demanded is higher than quantity supplied, and that is a shortage. And let's think about intuition. We always use intuition to verify our graph. So here, when the price is too low, the low price is a high incentive to consumption. Therefore, we have a lot of quantity demanded. And the too low price hurts suppliers. Therefore, suppliers are less likely, less willing to produce as many products. Therefore, quantity supplied is lower than quantity demanded. There is an unmet need, which is the shortage. Reflecting in real life, there is a long queue waiting. Yet, there won't be enough products to meet that needs. So that's the first one. And the second one is when we have a too high price. In that case, here, this one is a quantity coming from supply, therefore quantity supplied. And the second one is a quantity coming from demand, therefore it's quantity demanded. And here you see quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. So that is a surplus in quantity. Okay. So we talked about this, right? The dynamicness of equilibrium is to say such a low price or high price will not be able to persist in the long run. The reason for that is here we have a shortage. Eventually, some of the consumers is gonna pay more to the suppliers to meet their needs. Therefore, the price has a tendency to go up when it is currently too low. And in this case, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded when the price is high because it is too profitable to attract a lot of supply, but it is too costly to deter consumers. But this is not persistent in the long run because eventually the suppliers will be worried about their stocking and try to do a clearance sale to get rid of that. And such a sale means the price's tendency to go down. And eventually there could be several rounds of turbulences, but eventually it's gonna stabilize at the equilibrium point, which is the third graph. So those are the setting. And here we're saying eventually it's going to get into market equilibrium, but for certain purposes, the government issues some intervention, and in this case, specifically manipulating the price so that the price can, when it was low, cannot go higher. When it's high, cannot go lower, cannot converge to the market equilibrium as they would naturally tend to do so. So how would that make that? How can we make that happen? Well, we are replicating such a low price. However, what we are doing is we issue a hard restriction. So, first question here, should we have this one as a price ceiling or price floor? Here the answer is it should be a price ceiling. Okay, price ceiling means it is the capped maximum price. And it would only be binding if it is lower than the equilibrium price, which is the intersection point here. Okay, so the price can only go up to this high, up to here. That makes sense? All right. So if it is a price floor, the price can go higher. If it is a price floor, like going this way, going above this, right? As we discussed, when price currently is too low, then it's gonna bounce back and stop at the equilibrium. That's why we say, in this case, a too low price floor will not be binding, and a price ceiling has to be lower than the equilibrium price. So that is our first task. What is a binding price control? And for the ceiling case, it should be lower than the equilibrium price. So then move on to the second task. What will be the real life example? Well, we're controlling the price, preventing it from going too high, right? So it could be restriction on grocery, on essentials, so that the price doesn't increase crazily beyond the affordability of normal people. That could be one. The other is that we issue rent control, right? So that the rent does not go exceedingly high to make the houses irresistible or beyond affordability. So in that case, you can only go this high, you can't go further. Assume that if we allow the market to operate by itself, it's gonna be the monthly rent will be $1,500. A binding price ceiling should be somewhere lower, say 1,200. Again, it tells you a binding price ceiling should be lower than the equilibrium price. Okay, so that's the second thing from the price ceilings perspective. And the third one is about consumer surplus and producer surplus. To analyze that, the first step that we should go is to look at the baseline, the equilibrium case. And as we discussed before, market equilibrium possesses the feature of efficiency, and efficiency from a social welfare perspective means that we have the highest possible social welfare. And social welfare is a summation Social welfare is the summation of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So, consumer surplus and producer surplus, where are they? Consumer surplus comes from consumers, so that should be bordered by the demand curve. That has something to do with the demand. So the upper triangle is the consumer surplus, and the producer surplus has something to do with the producer, so it should be bordered by the supply curve. Therefore, the lower triangle is the producer surplus. And here we have a complete big triangle. That's the social welfare. That's how big the economic pie is. Okay, that's the ideal case for us to control to. Such a market, if the government is totally laissez-faire, meaning that there is totally zero governmental intervention. And now let's see how the governmental intervention will distort, will mess up with the market. And that's why we are so vigilant about the government's meddling, right? So first, we need to figure out what will be the actual transaction. And in the market equilibrium, indubitably, it's the equilibrium quantity. But in here, we have two candidates, quantity demanded, quantity supplied. Which one should be the actual how much products being sold, being transacted in this case? Well, it is supposed to be the lower one. Let's go to the intuition. So in terms of rent control, right, like a Section 8 uh, or housing authority, stuff like that. So in such a case, we may have a lot of demand because the price is relatively low. Think about it. If it is only $200 per month, is there going to be a lot of people willing to buy it? The answer is yes. There's going to be a long queue. There's going to be a lot of applicants. Yet, will there be a lot of people willing to rent their house at such a low price? The answer is no, right? The low price hurts the incentive of the landlord. Some landlord would be looking at if it is $200, even lower than 1,200, it's so low, $200 per month, they will be thinking about, oh, the money that we collect can't even cover completely the maintenance per month. Why do we bother to rent it out, right? So here, as you see, whatever will eventually be transacted in this case is dependent on how the lower quantity, how many houses are available in the market, not how many people are in the queue, because there are definitely gonna be people in the queue waiting for it, waiting for the house, but not be able to get it. So that's the first one, okay? To which extent the transaction will go to. And then, based on that, we use the similar rule, we're able to discern where is producer surplus. Producer surplus still is the difference between the actual transaction and the willingness to accept. So, which is bordered by the supply curve. So here, the lower triangle is the producer surplus. Then what's the consumer surplus? Knowing that the transaction will only carry on to QS, that's why we further continue up this QS until it intersects with the demand. So the producer surplus will be the upper wedge-ish shape. That will be the consumer surplus, right? Because it is bordered by the demand, so it tells you this area has something to do with the consumer, and it is the surplus that is for each transaction the difference between the willingness to pay the marginal benefit, your willingness to pay, say you're willing to pay $25,000 per month, but you go to the market and found under the price control it's only charged at $1,200, and then your psychological saving extra gain from this transaction is 2,500 minus 1,200, which is 1,300. For each house transacted, there will be such an extra gain until the maximum scale of transaction, which is to QS. So That's consumer surplus and producer surplus. And then let's look at the social welfare, the total social welfare in this case. That would be consumer surplus added producer surplus. So that's the total ladder shape with this triangle lost in comparison to the originally complete triangle under an unintervened market equilibrium. So therefore, this one that we lose, the total welfare that we lose as a consequence of distorted market is called deadweight loss. That's the deadweight loss. And something further about that is who is benefited in this case. And we use intuition, right? Rent control will make tenants happy, will make landlord, the producers, sad. And how, to which extent, how much will there be sadder? How much will there be will the tenant be happier? That is done through the comparison to the original equilibrium. So I recover this equilibrium price, 1500, if we don't have the price control, right? In that case, the total lower triangle will be producer surplus. The total upper triangle will be consumer surplus. And here you see this rectangle area would have been belonged to the producer, now be transferred to the consumer, right? And why is that? That is because the price being lowered, right? The price being lowered, meaning each house that we sold, that we rent out, we could have rented $1,500 if no intervention, and now we have to do $1,200. Then each house that we rent, we lose $300, the difference. So with the difference, it is the landlord's loss, it's the tenant's gain, right? That's why this area, this welfare was transferred from the landlord, the producer, to the tenant, the consumers. So here we complete everything of the price ceiling. Then we switch to price floor, which is something similar. It's just a different direction. So for a price floor, we have a too high price, used to be a temporary. That's why I used a dash. And now we solidify this by encoding a law of price control. And here we know for the to make the price low, we use price ceiling, and here to make the price high, price no lower than this, we use price floor, which is a manually or artificially set low price. Bottom price. And this will only be binding if it is higher than the equilibrium price, right? If it is lower than the equilibrium price, it gives the price the room to go back to equilibrium. That will not be binding for a price floor. So now the price floor is here. And with that, first, we're going to be looking at, again, to which extent the transaction will be for the market. And again, we have two candidates. QD comes from the demand curve and QS comes from the supply curve. Let's use intuition to figure out which one will be the actual transaction scale of transaction. It will be, again, still be the lower one. So here, the general idea is lower quantity candidate be the actual scale of market transactions. Okay, and now let's verify that with our intuition. So first, let's figure out what is a price floor in our intuition. Well, it is that a price cannot be lower than that, right? So an example for that is minimal price for agriculture products producers because we want to, I mean, conceptually, we want to support our farmers, right? If the farm price, if their farm products are too cheap, very likely we're gonna lose some of them, and eventually it's gonna backlash to threaten our national food security. That's something that we don't want to endanger. So that's this. And now let's think about the reality. In this case, because farmers are supported and farmers are the suppliers, right? They're able to sell their products at a higher price. Therefore, they're incentivized to produce much more. And because the price is becoming too expensive, consumers are dissuaded somehow, right? So in that case, for instance, the seller under the farmers under this price, say $5 per pound, per pound, and they are willing to produce 5 million pounds, but with $5 per pound, consumers there's only 2 million pounds of consumption. Then eventually, how much will be sold in the market? That's 2 million. The rest of 3 million will end up with being in the storage, or some of them perished. Right? So whichever lower between quantity supplied and quantity demanded when they are mismatched, it is the one that determines the actual scale of the transaction. With that figured out, then let's go through the social welfare part. First, let's figure out the consumer surplus and producer surplus. So here, the producer surplus is something to do with the supplier, and the consumer surplus is something to do with the producer and with the demand, right? So in this case, we can see that the producer surplus is much fatter than consumer surplus. Why is that? Well, it is because price floor is benefiting the producers, in this case, the farmers, right? Therefore, they are benefited, but the consumers, we have to pay, we have to sustain a higher cost, higher price. See, originally the price would be $2, $3 per pound, and now it's manually elevated to 5. So consumers gain is consumers loss is producers gain. And then the total social welfare is the upper triangle plus the lower wedge. So we have the total ladder shape, and the triangle in the middle is lost. That is that we lost because we are comparing to the case where we have no, if we have no price control imposed, then it's gonna be the entire consumer surplus plus producer surplus, the entire triangle be the case. And here that is lost, which is the consequence of distortion from equilibrium due to artificial manipulation of price, namely price control. And then specifically, we said price control, the price floor in this case, the elevated price benefits the producer. How much is that? Well, we can introduce the original equilibrium price, right? So in the original division, of social welfare. The upper triangle would be consumer surplus, the lower triangle would be producer surplus, and here we can see this rectangle, which used to be consumer surplus, part of consumer surplus, now is transferred to the producer. And that is exactly because the price being elevated $2 per pound from 3 to 5. Then for each quantity transacted, for each pound of product sold, consumer will be worse off by $2. And that's how much being sold in total by QD. The total of the area of this rectangle will be the transfer, will be the loss of the consumer and the gain of producer because of this price flow. So that will be the total of the discussion of price ceiling and floor. I hope this is helpful.